In this video, we will be learning brands and products in a global context. So products is one of the four Ps. The four Ps are product, place, price, and promotion. And as we all know, if a company does not have a good product or a good service, then they can't compete, and they're going to fail. So understanding products and brands, and we'll be looking at the difference between brands and products. But products is very important. It's like the most fundamental and basic ingredient that a company has to have in order to succeed. So having quality products that differentiate from the competition is critical for success. So, what is a product? A product can be a good, right? It could be a service, or it can even be an idea, right? So, which then basically means that a product can be something that's tangible. So, if it's a good, that means it's a tangible, right? It's a tangible, like a laptop, a digital camera, or a running shoe. These are goods. So these are dominated by tangible attributes, whereas services. So for instance, banking, or restaurants, or hotels. These are services. The hospitality industry. These are all services. So these have to do with the human element, right? Because humans serve customers. They interact with the customers. And therefore, these are dominated by intangible attributes. So depending on whether we're talking about goods or services, different types of attributes, dominate, the type of product that we're referring to. Also, product. So if we're gonna focus on goods for that matter, there can be two different types of goods: consumer goods and industrial goods. So consumer goods are like the everyday goods that we shop at grocery stores, at department stores, or like we shop at Amazon. So these are typically in a B2C context, business to customers, whereas industrial goods are these are goods that companies buy from other companies, like chemical, like steel, like rubber, so these are in raw materials that companies buy from their suppliers that they use as ingredients to manufacture the next stage of the product. So products can be differentiated into consumer goods and also industrial goods. The next slide shows you what we call the onion model. So here it's like products are hierarchical. The attributes that are included in products are hierarchical in the sense that we call this the onion model, and the reason being is that a product is made up of different layers of attributes. So typically we say that a product is comprised of three different layers. The core layer, the expected layer, and the augmented layer. So the core layer is, as the name implies, it's basic. These are the must-haves. These are the type of attributes that all products need to have if they want to, compete in the market. So these are, the right or the ticket to compete in a given market. So these are the minimal requirements that all companies must have. In other words, another word for this is POP, point of parity, right? So these are things that don't differentiate you from your competition. Why? Because it's a must-have. It's a minimum requirement that all companies or brands must have to compete in a market. The next layer is the expected layer, and these are layers that provide basic levels of differentiation. They don't provide a significant level of differentiation that really, make you stand out from the pack. But these are the entry-level type of differentiations that, brands, that products have. Whereas the more complex forms of differentiation that really make you stand out from the competition, that can provide customers with wow factors, that surprise customers, that delight customers, are the augmented layer. So if you combine the augmented layer and the expected layer, these can be combined into what we call the PODs, right? The point of differences. Although there are, the augmented layer is a stronger form, it's a more advanced form of POD than is the expected layer. One of the critical elements of products, and which is becoming more important in today's business, is packaging. Packaging kind of has to do with design, but it's a little bit different, but I want to talk a little bit about packaging, especially not necessarily much so in industrial goods, in a B2B context, but for consumer goods, packaging has become a point of differentiation. Companies are differentiating and providing a lot of sensual value, experiential value, emotional value by using packaging. So a lot of alcohol companies, especially vodka companies, are using different forms of bottles, different colors of bottles to give out more of an elegant, more high-end premium type of image by using these packaging elements. As are chocolate companies like Godiva, are using very upscale type of elegant packaging for their chocolates. And then you can also see water companies doing that. Some of you may be familiar with this water company, but this brand, Voss, right? This is probably the first water brand that has used not plastic bottles, but glass bottles. So, as we all know, the water bottles that we, consume and purchase are mainly plastic. But this was one of the first companies that started using glass for their waters. And they sold at a very high price. Initially, by using these elegant and upscale packaging, they penetrated upscale hotels, upscale nightclubs in New York City and Manhattan. And they used viral marketing, using celebrities to sort of get the word out. And they were taking pictures of celebrities holding this elegant-looking glass bottle in their hands, and then they were disseminating this through social media to spread the positive word of mouth amongst customers, to get the word out that we're using a different type of packaging, a different type of design to communicate our super premium brand image. Next, we move on to this concept called PLC. PLC stands for Product Life Cycle. And basically what this concept is about is just like we as humans go through different stages in our life, from infant to toddler to adolescent to teenager to adult to senior citizens. When we go through different stages in our life, the same can be said for products. So products here, they go through a development stage, and then they get introduced into the market, and then they go through a growth stage, and then they peak at the maturity stage, and then some products will die out. The companies will terminate the product. They'll stop launching the product in the market as they go through the decline stage. So products go through these stages, and some products go through this faster than others, and it kind of looks like a normal distribution. Not exactly, but the peak typically occurs at the maturity stage, and then it levels off as you approach the decline stage. This slide shows you some of the different targets, the different objectives, and some of the different things that are important as a product goes through the different stages. So from a marketing, objective perspective, as you can see in the introduction stage, because people don't know about the product, the key goal is to obtain increased awareness, right? It's to increase awareness. So they'll do a lot of advertising to make the product, to increase the awareness of the product. And then as it goes through the growth stage, as it goes into the growth stage, the objective will be on differentiation. So they'll stress and they'll try to emphasize how this product is different from other products. All right, so there the focus is on differentiation. And then in the maturity stage, the focus will be on trying to sustain brand loyalty, right? They're going to, once you've, created some loyalty amongst customers, they want to maintain that. And then in the decline stage, the goal will be try to milk things out, because they know that, it's going to die out in the near future. So they want to milk, as much out as possible. So they'll try to harvest. Or if they see some hope and they feel that they could give new life to this product, then they may want to revitalize the product. So that's circumstantial. That'll depend on how the product is doing in the decline stage, but it'll be either harvest or revitalize. And then in terms of competition, in the introduction, there'll be very little or no competition. And then in the growth stage, the competition will obviously it'll start picking up and it'll grow. And then in the maturity stage, the competition will be at its peak. There'll be lots of competition. And then as you approach the decline stage, the competition will also will be diminished as well. And then for sales, introduction, probably low. In the growth stage, it'll be rapidly rising. And then at the maturity stage, it's at its apex, it's at its peak. And then in the decline stage, obviously the sales will start to dip and it'll start to taper off. And then in terms of cost, the introduction stage, it's probably going to be very high because they have to invest in a lot of advertising to get the word out, to create brand awareness and so forth. And then in the growth stage, it'll be average. And then hopefully in the maturity and the decline stage, people will be very familiar with the product. Therefore, they don't have to engage in that much advertising. So, the cost will start to decline, and therefore, it'll be a lot lower. And then in terms of profits, in the introduction, mostly, on average, probably negative, not too much. But as you go through the growth of the maturity stage, at the maturity stage, hopefully the profit will be at its peak. And then again, at the decline stage, it'll start to decline. And then we have the different type of customers, depending on the growth stage, the 4 different stages. And then in terms of products, since this video is on products, in the introduction, there'll be very few products. And then in the growth stage, there'll be more versions. They'll be branching out. So the company is typically likely to provide different types of versions. And then at the maturity stage, it'll peak. There'll be a full line, a full version. And then at the decline stage, only it's the survival of the fittest. So some products will die out and, they'll fail. And then only the best sellers will survive and be left over. So that's why at the decline stage, the best sellers are the ones that will be remaining. Okay. Up to now, I've been kind of using products and brands interchangeably. But strictly speaking, technically speaking, products and brands are different. This slide sort of gives you, an idea of how the two are, different. Products these are generic. These are, something that's made in a factory. There is not much differentiation. A product can be copied fairly easy by a competitor, and it can be outdated fairly quickly. Whereas brands are, they have image, they have personality. these are bought by the customers. A brand is differentiated. So, like running shoes is a product, but Nike, Under Armour, or Adidas, Brooks, these are brands. So these have different brand images. They have different personalities, and they last a long time. Brands can last a long time, and it's unique. It's differentiated. So, to make a long story short, products are more generic. There's less differentiation, whereas brands are not generic. They're unique, and they're idiosyncratic, and they're differentiated items. A brand is a name, a term, a symbol, or a design. So it could be one of those. It could be a logo, right? Or it could be a combination of those that are intended to identify the goods and services of one seller from another. And one of the most important things, like I said before in the previous slide, one of the key goals of that survey is to differentiate them from the competition in the minds of the customers. So a brand is used to differentiate, right, one from another. And most importantly, brand is a promise of value. So when customers purchase a certain brand over another brand, they do so even if it may be slightly more expensive. Why? Because they believe in their hearts that by buying this brand at a slightly higher price, it's going to deliver, some type of value that they expect, whether it's functional value, whether it is experiential value, or whether it's social value, or it's economic value by saving you cost, whatever it may be, or a combination of multiple values. When a customer buys a brand, it's expecting value. So a brand has to deliver and promise on that value that they and by delivering on it. Okay, so the next two slides, I'm going to show you how brand information, how information about brands are stored and how they're configured in the brain, in the minds of customers. So let's take the example of Coke. So when people think of Coke, right, some people will have very elaborate, deep, detailed, rich, information about Coke, whereas others, if you're not a Coke fan, then, you're going to have very shallow, very simple, not very complex information about Coke. So if you are a Coke fan, that's assuming that, you have some knowledge about Coke. You're highly involved with this brand. Therefore, you're going to have more complex, deeper, and richer configuration of information that's stored in the brain. So, for example, Coke, represents America. It's the real thing. It reminds you of polar bear, about Christmas. It's red, or it could be white. Coke is it. It's brown. It's sweet. It's yummy. It's fizzy. It comes from Atlanta. Headquarters is in Atlanta. Whereas, if you're a Coke fan, you're not going to like Pepsi. So they have a negative emotion towards Pepsi. So different pieces of information are configured, and they're intertwined. They're integrated in the brains of Coke fans. The same thing can be said for Pepsi. If you're a Pepsi fan, then you're going to have, Pepsi's a very dynamic, it's a very young brand. It's a risk-taking brand compared to Coke. Coke is a very traditional brand. It's a very conservative brand, whereas Pepsi is not. So if you look at the Super Bowls, a lot of the Super Bowl halftimes, they're sponsored by Pepsi. You never see a Super Bowl halftime show that's sponsored by Coke. Pepsi is into these events, music, sporting events. So it's a very young, it's very dynamic, it's hip. So Pepsi is generation. For those who think young, again, Pepsi, similar to Coke, is brown, sweet, fizzy, yummy. It's blue. Whereas if you're a Pepsi fan, and you're going to have negative emotions towards Coke. They're going to think that Coke is yucky, whereas Pepsi's, they're all good. So again, these different information will be stored in the minds of customers. So as you can see from this slide and the previous Coke slide here, if you look at towards the bottom, we have brown, sweet, yummy, fizzy. that's affiliated with Coke. And the same can be said for Pepsi as well. And then we have some unique information like, young, Pepsi generation for Pepsi, whereas for Coke, it's Polar Bear, the real thing, Coke is it. So the brown, sweet, yummy, fizzy, these overlap. As you can see, they're common across the two brands. So based on what we learned before, these are like the POPs. These are like the POPs, right? Point of parity. So these are information that's shared across different brands, right? That every brand in the carbonated soft drink typically has. Whereas the young, the Pepsi generation, for those who think young, or for Coke, the Polar Bear, the Coke is it, the real thing. These are unique to Coke, and young Pepsi generation, these are unique to Pepsi. So these are like the pods, the PODs. So as you can see, for a brand, there's going to be POP information, and then there's going to be POD information. And that applies to other brands as well, but we're just comparing the Pepsi and the Coke. So which gets to the idea of brand associations. And like I said before, these different information are stored like an associative network. So they're intertwined, they're configured in the brains and the minds of customers. And we call this the associative network model because they're kind of like a spider, they're like a network and they're all associated with one another. So that's why we call it the associative network model. And there are three elements, three characteristics that we want to see in this associative network models where information is stored in the brains of the customers. So the first is we want the information to be strong. We want these information that are intertwined and integrated to be strong, tightly knit. We don't want them to be weak. We want them to be strong and tightly knit. We want them to be unique as well. We don't want all POPs because then there's nothing different from your brand compared to the competition. So we want unique brands. Unique information, but we also want them to be favorable. We want them to be positive. Right? So that's going to give you some, very, a favorable, evaluation compared to the competitors. So again, we want the information to be strong, tightly knit. We want them to be unique, differentiated, but at the same time, we want them to be favorable. Okay, the next concept is brands can be thought of, can be conceived of at different levels. So here we have 5 levels of brand meaning. So the 5 levels are attributes, benefits, values, culture, and personality. And what this basically means is that a brand can be conceptualized and the meaning of a brand can be represented at different levels of abstraction. So as you go from top to bottom, from attributes to benefits and so on, all the way down to personality, they're at different levels of abstraction. So attributes or features, these are the most concrete, and then it gets a little more abstract as you go from attributes to benefits, and then a little more as you go from benefits to values, and then more abstract as you go from values to culture, and then more so as you go from culture to personality. So as you can see, take the example of Ivory Soap. The brand Ivory Soap can be best represented at the attribute level, right? Because Ivory Soap is about pureness. That's what they're known for. It's gentle, pure. So Ivory Soap as 99.94% pure. That's at a feature attribute level. But take the example of Harley Davidson, right? Harley Davidson, they have a subculture called HOG, H-O-G, Harley Davidson Owner Group, and that's like a culture of its own. So you may have seen people driving a Harley Davidson, like packs of 5 or 10, all grouped together driving on the highway or on the street, and they dress similarly. They look very similar. They hang out together, and they have their own culture. So that's Harley Davidson has a very unique, distinct culture that attracts people to buy their brands. If you don't like that culture, then you're not a Harley person. You may go for a BMW or Kawasaki or Suzuki. But people who like that type of culture will be motivated to be part of that, and they want to be part of the HOG. So Harley Davidson, can be represented, is a brand that can be represented, from a cultural perspective. And then, Virgin, Richard Branson is the founder of Virgin. He's a very unique person. He has a very unique personality, and that gets spilled over into the brand Virgin. So Virgin, the group Virgin, it does business in many different industries, from airlines to cellular phones to financial industry. And they have this personality that is represented, that reflects the founder, Richard Branson. So different levels can be used to represent brands. The ABC of successful brands. So the A stands for affect. Affect means emotion, right? Feelings, liking. The B here stands for behavior. In other words, behavior in a brand context would be purchase, would be buying. Cognition is about thinking, right? Cognition means thinking. So in order for a brand to be successful, it needs to have all three, right? So first, people need to be able to think about the brand. They need to be aware about the brand. So brand awareness is the first step typically. And then once they're aware about the brand, then they have to like the brand. Right? That's emotion. There has to be an emotional attachment to a brand. They have to prefer the brand. They have to have feelings toward the brand. And then third, ultimately, the end game is based on awareness and feeling and emotions, they have to buy the brand. If you do all the previous two, but people don't buy the brand, then there's going to be issues. So behavior represents purchase behavior or buying behavior. So all three are important for a successful brand, but ultimately at the end of the day, it all has to lead to behavior. Brand knowledge. So how do consumers accumulate and how do they, build knowledge about, a brand? Well, it can come from a lot of different sources, like we just said. It can come from thoughts, right? Awareness, thinking. It could come from feelings, emotions, likings. It could come from beliefs, what they believe about a particular brand. Or it could come from images, right? The image that I have towards a certain brand. But then again, it could come through experiences, right? I mean, based on my personal experience or based on my observational experience, they may develop firsthand or secondhand knowledge about brands. The next slide shows an important model called the Kano model. And basically, it's named after the person, Kano, that came up with this model. And Kano suggested that all products are basically made up of three different types of features or attributes. The three features are basic or expected attributes, performance or spoken attributes, and then the third are surprise or delight attributes. He said that all products are basically made up of these three to different degrees, to different levels. So some products are dominated by basic or expected, some evenly across the three, some more by surprise or delight. So as you can see here on this, in this model, on the x-axis we have degree of achievement, ranging from not at all achieved to fully achieved. And then on the y-axis we have level of satisfaction, ranging from not at all satisfied, very dissatisfied, to very satisfied. And you'll see that depending on which attribute we are referring to, the red lines show different shape and form. So for the basic or expected attribute, it's nonlinear, right? It's curved, but it never exceeds, it never goes above that horizontal, the x-axis. Whereas for the surprise or delight attribute, it's again nonlinear, but it never goes below the x-axis. And then for the performance or spoken attribute, it's linear. It's linear, it goes through the origin. So let's briefly explain why the basic or expected attribute looks like the way it is, and for the other two attributes as well. So if you first start out with basic or expected attributes, you can see that, because it's basic or expected, even if you fully achieve it, you can only generate so much satisfaction. Whereas because it's basic or expected, if you don't have it, then it's going to create a lot of dissatisfaction. In other words, even by fully achieving a basic or expected attribute, you're not going to be rewarded handsomely. Whereas if you don't achieve it, then you're going to be penalized dearly. Right? Whereas for a surprise or delight attribute, it's the opposite, right? Because it's surprise, because it wows the customers, and because people don't expect it and competitors don't have it, if you do achieve it, you're going to wow the customer by creating a very high level of satisfaction. But even if you don't achieve it, because customers don't expect it or competitors don't have it, you're not going to disappoint customers. That's why it never goes below the x-axis. And then for performance or spoken attributes, it's proportional. The level of satisfaction that you're going to create is proportional to the level of achievement and to the level of not achieving. Hence, that's why it's linear. And then you see that on the lower left-hand side, we have that arrow time pointing downwards. And what that implies is that what was once a surprise or delight attribute, over time will eventually become a basic or expected attribute, right? Because why? There are two reasons as to why that can happen. One, customers come to expect things over time. Number two, competition is able to copy and imitate over time. So what was something that was a surprise or delight attribute that one company may have, unless it's patent and it's protected, things will, change, and, customers will come to expect that because things will disseminate and, diffuse in the market over time. And, the competition will be able to copy and imitate over time. So what was once a surprise or delight attribute will eventually evolve into a basic or expected attribute. So what this is basically saying is that a company has to constantly innovate and develop these surprise or delight attributes into their products in order to stay ahead of the pack and be a front runner. If a product or service has very little surprise or no surprise or delight attributes and only has basic or expected attributes, even if you fully achieve those, you're always going to be lagging and you're always going to be a follower. You will never be able to be a pioneer or be a front leader because this model shows you that because it doesn't generate enough level of satisfaction to generate customer loyalty and to make customers repeat coming back to you, and that's going to have limitations if you're not able to achieve that. The next concept is about brand personality. You may recall that at the start of the video, one of the distinctions between products and brands is that brands have personalities, products do not. So research has shown that brands, at least in the North American context, brands can be represented according to 5 different personalities. The first one is sincerity. Second, excitement. Third, competence. Fourth, sophistication. And then the last 5th is ruggedness. So some brands are very sincere. They're down to earth. They're honest. Right? Some brands are very sophisticated. They're upper class. They give out this premium personality. Some brands are very rugged. So like a Jeep Cherokee, or Jeep Wrangler. I mean, the personality of a Jeep Cherokee is ruggedness, right? That's what they're known for. Whereas brands such as Mercedes is sophistication, or Lexus is sophistication. A brand such as North Face may be competence, because it's waterproof, or Gore-Tex, it's waterproof. So different brands have different personalities. And that's one way that companies use these personalities to differentiate themselves from the competition. And research has shown that in different parts of the world, some components of these personalities can be replaced with other personalities. So for instance, in Spain, peacefulness instead of ruggedness. So ruggedness is not a very popular personality, I guess, for brands, in the Spanish context. As is passion instead of competence. So instead of competence, passion is more important. And then in Japan as well, instead of ruggedness, peacefulness is important. So, depending on the culture, depending on the country, there may be some common overlapping personalities, but there can be some unique personalities that are tailored, that are unique to that particular country or that particular culture. Brand equity. So we use this concept, a lot. You may have, seen this, read about brand equity in the media, and so we use this fairly loosely. But what is brand equity? I mean, equity is a good thing, right? We say that if you accumulate equity in your home, right, that's a good thing because that means that you're getting more of your home. And home equity is good. So equity is always when equity is used with some other word, that's a positive thing. That's a good thing. As is brand equity. So a brand accumulates and develops and builds equity over time. It means that brand equity is a differential effect that brand knowledge has on consumer response to the marketing of that brand. In other words, brand equity is something that people attach to through the knowledge that they have towards that brand. So the more familiar they are, the more aware of the brand that they are, and the more strong and unique and favorable associations that they can attach to the brand, then all of these things collectively will contribute to building brand equity. So basically what this basically means is that if a brand has high brand equity, that means that people are very well aware of the brand. That means that they're very familiar with the brand. That means that they have very strong, unique, and favorable, associations. They have very favorable, images of that brand, which basically ultimately translates into they're probably going to be willing to pay a premium for that brand. Another way to think about this, or another way to sort of measure this, this is making it very simple to get the point across, but is if you compare, let's say, two laptops, an Apple, a MacBook Pro, to, let's say, a PC. Let's say that they have the same, RAM, same storage, same battery life, same screen size, and same weight. So basically, the configuration of the laptops are almost identical. But if people are willing to pay more for an Apple laptop, despite the physical and the technical configuration, identical configuration, then that difference in amount that they're willing to pay, that differential, is indicative of the equity of Apple, the brand equity of Apple. That's Apple's brand equity. Right? So basically, the differential in the amount that customers are willing to pay between two brands that are seemingly identical captures as a manifestation of that brand's brand equity. So other ways that you can measure, right, that you can put your hand on brand equity is maybe through these surveys. So if you look at these 4 questions, and the more that you agree with these 4 questions, the stronger is the brand equity for, in this case, brand X, which let's say is the focal brand, is your brand. So let's read the first question. So it makes sense to buy brand X instead of any other brand, even if they are the same. So if customers agree with this statement, the more that the customers agree with this statement, the higher the brand X's brand equity is compared to the competition. The second question, even if another brand has the same features as brand X, I would still prefer to buy brand X. So again, the more that customers agree with such a statement, the higher is brand X's brand equity compared to the competition. And the same logic can be said for the other 2 questions as well. So for something like this, right? So if you want to measure, brand X's brand equity, you can take, survey questions such as these and ask customers to see where brand X stacks up against the competition. So you can do this for brand X, you can do it for other brands, and compare the brand equity for the different brands. So what's the fuss, about brand equity? Why are we interested? What are the benefits of brand equity? So we said that brand equity is a good thing, which I think we all can agree on. So brand equity leads to greater loyalty. right? Less vulnerability to marketing actions, less vulnerability to marketing crisis. So, if a competitor, does something, lowers their price, then if the focal brand has more equity, then you're going to be less vulnerable to the competitive actions. Right? If customers are less likely to switch, why? Because the brand has high brand equity. Or if something goes wrong with the brand, if the brand fails, right, or it doesn't deliver, if you've been able to accumulate high brand equity, then customers may be willing to forgive you, give you a second chance, give you the benefit of the doubt. They're going to give you another chance to make up for it. Why? Because it has high brand equity. Larger margins, that means more profitability. More inelastic consumer response to price increase. So even if you raise your price, if you have high brand equity, customers are still going to buy. They're not going to buy less. That's what we mean by more inelastic. Whereas the opposite is true, more elastic consumer response to price decrease. So if you lower your price, then customers are going to buy more from you. And then the last one is increased marketing communication effectiveness. So if you have high brand equity, you're going to get more return on your investment from engaging in marketing communication. So, you get more bang for your buck from marketing communications if your brand has high brand equity. Why? Because your marketing communications will be more credible. People are going to believe more. It's going to be more reliable. People will think that it's more valid. Why? Because the brand has high brand equity. Okay, so let me give you a quote by the chairman of Samsung Group, the Korean consumer electronics. Samsung manufactures consumer electronics, but it's a conglomerate. It's a jebel, and the chairman said, "Think of why I called this conference in Milan. Right? Milan is a city in Italy, of all places." And you'll probably know what Milan is famous for. I'll tell you shortly. Samsung's products must meet global premium standards. In order to do that, we must strengthen competitiveness in soft areas such as design and brand, and leap over emotional walls, in addition to functional and technical ones. So what the chairman of Samsung is trying to say is that a product that's manufactured by Samsung, let's say, cell phones, that's what they're best known for, cell phones. I mean, having the functional and the technical prowess is important. The superiority is important. But that's not all. As you may be aware of, Samsung devotes a lot of resources. They emphasize design in their cell phones. They take this very seriously. So, the CEO is saying that, we're going to hold a conference in Milan because Milan is the design capital of the world, or in Italy. That's where a lot of, high-end fashion designers are. Therefore, they want to, engage in the most cutting edge, in the most fashionable design into their cell phones, in addition to the functional and the technical features that they embed in their phones. So brand is more than just functional value. It's about emotional value as well, even for a company such as Samsung that that manufactures high-tech products like cell phones. Let's move on to the difference between brand versus line extension. So a lot of people get confused between these two concepts, but it's not that complex. It's very easy to understand once you get the hang of it. So what is brand extension? So brand extension basically means that a company now launches a product into a new product category, into a totally different product category from their core product category, right? So let's say that, Porsche, to give you an example, like Porsche and Ferrari, they're known for manufacturing, high-end luxury sports cars. But we know that Porsche and Ferrari, they also, do business in men's fashion accessories. Porsche makes men's clothing. They make men's accessories, belts, shoes. They also make, luggages. And same thing with Ferrari. They make belts. They make sunglasses. So these are examples of brand extension. Why? Because they're going they're launching products in a very different product category from their core product category. So the same thing can be said for these conglomerates, right? Virgin, Tata Group from India, and for Samsung. They do business in very different product categories, service categories, from what they're known for, from their core. So that's brand extension. Line extension, on the other hand, is when you are tweaking things and you are creating different versions of a product, but you are still in the same product category. You're not launching a new product in a different product category, but it's in the same category, but a different version, so to speak. So, if a car company, goes from a 4-door to a 2-door, or from a sedan to an SUV, or from a sedan to SUV, and then to a pickup truck, or to a minivan, or to an EV. All of these would be line extension example. Or from just manufacturing gasoline cars to diesel cars, again now to electrical cars to hybrid cars, or a soap company from bar soap to liquid soap, or for Coke for that matter, from cherry Coke, from regular Coke to Diet Coke to cherry Coke to caffeine-free Coke to lime Coke. These are all Coke. They're all still Coke. There's no difference. It's just different flavors. So these are examples of from line extensions. Why? Because they're still in the same product category. Brand value. What is brand value? Brand value is, to make a long story short, it's putting a financial worth, or a monetary value to a brand, right? So brand value is the absolute financial worth, monetary worth of the brand as it stands today. So people try to monetize and try to put a financial value to brands, right? And there's a company that have done extensive research on this, and it's the company called, brand consulting company called Interbrand. So Interbrand every year, publishes the top 100 global brands in the world. And here in this slide, I've shown you just the top 20 global brands, and I've shown you going back to 2010. And I'll show you what the most latest recent results are. But as you can see here, the top from 2010 all the way to 2012, the top brand was Coca-Cola, was Coke. And it's pretty amazing that it's not a complex brand, it's not a high-tech brand. It's syrup mixed with water, basically. And this is the top global brand in terms of financial worth in the world. And they've occupied this position. If you go back even before 2010, it's Coke. So all the way up to 2012, it was Coke. And then Apple took over in 2013. So as you can see, Apple, which I've highlighted in red, has slowly been on the rise from 17 in 2010 to 8 in 2012, and then in 2013 finally they occupied the peak position. And then Samsung as well. But as you can see here, amongst the top 20 brands, most of them are high-tech companies, high-tech brands. There are some exceptions, like I said, Coke or McDonald's, and then like Disney and Louis Vuitton. But even Amazon, that's a high-tech brand, right? That's a technology brand. So all of these brands, most of these brands, most of them are high-tech, which is very interesting to notice. And then most recently, 2017, Apple's at the top, followed by Google, Microsoft, and then all the way down to IBM. But again, out of these top 10 brands, what is it? I think 7 of them are high-tech brands. Is it 7? Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is the only one that's actually probably a non-high-tech. So 9 out of the 10 are high-tech brands. And another thing that's recognizable is that out of the 10, 7 of them are U.S. brands, right? The U.S. So the only non-U.S. are Samsung, which is from Korea, Toyota, which is from Japan, and then Mercedes from Germany. But all the others, the other 7, they're U.S. brands. So again, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, that's not the point. But it's interesting to notice that 70% of the top 10 brands are from the U.S.